All right, what's going on, you guys? Nick here with Nick Strength and Power. So I thought an interesting topic for you guys would be Vince McMahon's best bodybuilder. Now, as many of you guys know, back in the early 90s, Vince McMahon started a bodybuilding federation known as the WBF, or World Bodybuilding Federation. And I made several videos on this topic. But I wanted to talk specifically about the bodybuilder that won both years of this competition. So there were only 2 years of the WBF World Championships, 1991 and 1992. And a bodybuilder by the name of Gary Strydom won both of those competitions. Now, the interesting thing about what Vince McMahon did with these bodybuilders, and specifically what he did with Gary Strydom, was he specifically set out to make these guys into stars and to pay these guys like they were celebrities. So Gary Strydom in particular was making a salary of $400,000 a year, roughly $400,000 a year for a 3-year contract. So over $1 million to be a part of this WBF organization. So to give you guys a little frame of reference, the first place prize at the Mr. Olympia in 1991, which Lee Haney won, was $100,000. So that year, Gary Strydom, who won, Vince McMahon's competition, he got 4 times that amount for winning Vince McMahon's competition. And in fact, the total prize money for all the bodybuilders competing in the 1991 Mr. Olympia, that is first through 10th place, the total was only $250,000. So Gary Strydom was making almost twice what the entire lineup of the top 10 at the Olympia was making in 1991. So Vince McMahon set out with the clear goal of becoming a rival of the IFBB and a rival of Joe Weider. And he had picked Gary Strydom to be the spearhead of his operation, to be, the face of the WBF, similar to what Joe Weider did back in the day with Arnold Schwarzenegger. When Joe Weider came to the scene with the IFBB, he had to compete with NABA. He had to compete with the AAU, and he needed a guy that would be his main character, his main draw, his main attraction, and that guy became Arnold Schwarzenegger. And Vince McMahon tried to replicate this with a guy by the name of Gary Strydom. Vince McMahon had his own magazine line. It started out as Bodybuilding Lifestyles magazine, and it would become WBF magazine. And Gary Strydom was on most of the covers of those magazines, and Gary Strydom got most of the publicity coming out of the WBF. So let's talk a little bit more about Gary Strydom specifically. So Gary Strydom was actually a pretty tall bodybuilder, standing 6'2", and weighing roughly 280 to 290 pounds on stage. So he was very similar to Arnold in that regard, being a very tall bodybuilder. At the time, he kind of had that movie star good look quality to him like Arnold had back in the day. And this is just a guy where it's easy to see why Vince McMahon would go with a guy like this to be the face of his operation, because this guy, he pretty much had it all. And prior to coming into the WBF, Gary Strydom was actually a very impressive bodybuilder in the IFBB. He was a winner of one of the biggest shows in bodybuilding, being the Night of Champions. And he won the Night of Champions back in 1987. So bear in mind, at this time, back in 1987, there was no Arnold Classic yet. So essentially, there was the Mr. Olympia and there was the Night of Champions. And those were basically the 2 biggest shows in the late 80s before the Arnold Classic would come along in 1989. So Gary Strydom would win that second biggest show in bodybuilding, and that was his pro debut. He had just turned pro by winning the NPC Nationals in 1986. He would come right out of the gate and win the 1987 Night of Champions. Now, in 1988, his first Olympia appearance ever, he would place top 5. Now, he would go on to win and place very highly at many Grand Prix throughout 1989, all the way up until about 1990. And I think what really surprises a lot of people is after placing 5th at his first Olympia ever, we would not see Gary Strydom back on the Olympia stage. And after placing 1st at the Night of Champions, we would not see him back on the Night of Champions stage until almost 10 years later in 1996, where he would barely place, placing 12th at that show. So there's really always been a big question of why did he never compete in the Olympia again? Why did he not continue with his IFBB pro career? Why did he not pursue this further? Because this guy really did have an incredible physique, primarily from the front, though. His biggest weakness, many people would say, is lacking density in his back. But from the front, he was arguably one of the most complete, biggest, and freakiest bodybuilders of the 90s, period, next to a guy like Dorian Yates. I mean, some people have even gone as far to say that, if Gary Strydom had a better back, he could have been a multiple-time Mr. Olympia. He could have beaten Lee Haney. He could have beaten Dorian Yates. And I'm inclined to believe some of that could actually be true. If Gary Strydom had a better back, he would have been one of the biggest and most complete bodybuilders that the 90s had ever seen. Again, at 6'2", nearly 300-pound bodybuilder. Just a massive frame, massive structure, density, hardness. His conditioning was usually very good. I mean, this guy really did have it all. So unfortunately, history will go to show that the WBF was unsuccessful and it failed after its second competition in 1992. Those WBF World Championships will be the last championships ever held. And you really wouldn't hear from Gary Strydom again until 1996, where he would come back to the IFBB, do that Night of Champions show, and have a pretty bad placing. And then another 10 years later, he would make a comeback at the age of 47 in 2006 to compete in the Colorado Pro, where he placed 7th. Now, Gary Strydom is still alive today at the age of 58. I believe he's currently focusing on personal training. And he still looks pretty good, honestly, at the age of 58. But the fact of the matter was, back in the 90s, this guy was Vince McMahon's, pretty much his secret weapon. This was kind of his ace in the hole. And this was the guy that, Vince McMahon had in mind would take down the IFBB. He thought this would be the future biggest star in bodybuilding. He invested a ton of money in this guy. Arguably, there was a lot of controversy going on in the early 90s. Some of the other bodybuilders said that Gary Strydom wasn't drug tested, or he was allowed to pass the drug tests that the WBF did give. They gave drug tests in 1992. And a lot of the bodybuilders were saying that Gary Strydom wasn't made to take that test, that, it was rigged in favor of Gary Strydom because he was, Vince's favorite. So stuff like that, pretty much all the same stuff that they would say about the relationship of Arnold and Joe Weider back in the day was the relationship between Vince McMahon and Gary Strydom. So Gary Strydom was Vince's vision of the second coming of Arnold Schwarzenegger. So let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Please give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Nick Strength and Power, signing out.